The prosecution delivered their fiery closing argument in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial, highlighting why these are episodes of sex trafficking, why the evidence proves Combs operated a criminal enterprise, and how he directed and arranged multiple instances of transporting people for prostitution. We will break down the highlights of this closing argument right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is another Law&Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. That's right, Morgan & Morgan, they're investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, just takes a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on screen, click the link below, or go to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. Closing arguments are officially underway in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial. In fact, the prosecution just wrapped up their closing argument. Remember, this is the last chance for each side to summarize the evidence in this case, present their final conclusion, their narrative for the jury. And it's important. It's important because there's a lot for the jury to consider over these past few weeks. It is a complicated case. There is a lot of evidence. There's a lot of testimony. And closings are the last time the jurors will hear from the attorneys before they begin their deliberations. So we begin with the prosecution's closing argument that was delivered by Assistant United States Attorney Christy Slavic, outlining why the jury should find Combs guilty of 1 count of racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, 1 with respect to Cassie Ventura Fine, 1 with respect to Jane, and 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Again, 1 with respect to Cassie, 1 with respect to Jane. I want to bring on right now Law&Crime's reporter Elizabeth Millner, who was inside that courtroom for all of those arguments today. Elizabeth, great to see you. Want to take this piece by piece. Let's start it off with racketeering conspiracy. The top charge, arguably the most complicated charge in the mix, carries life in prison, okay? So there's a lot at stake here. The prosecutor definitely wanted to make it clear for the jury. How did she outline, let's start this, how did she outline that this is a criminal organization, that there was a criminal agreement? Let's start there before we even move into the underlying predicate crimes that the prosecution needs to prove.
Yeah, so right off the bat, Christy Slavic is really talking about count 1, of course, that being racketeering conspiracy, aka RICO. And just right off the bat, she's telling the jury, over the last several weeks, you learned about Sean Combs and then kidnapping an employee, forced labor, arson, bribery, plus brutal crimes are at the heart of the case. She also said, across all of these comes the defendant using his power and violence to get what he wants, and that he doesn't take no for an answer. And so right off at the top of her closing argument, the jury has shown exhibit photos, one of March 2016 Intercontinental Hotel still image from that surveillance video where you can kind of see Cassie on the ground after she was initially physically assaulted by Sean Combs on that videotape. And then also the government talked about Sean Combs kicking, choking, and slapping Jane and forcing her into a freak-off, specifically pointing to the instance that happened in June of 2024. And so, the government was like, these instances are separated by 8 years, but they're kind of saying they're one and the same. But I think the most interesting part of just the beginning of the closing argument by the prosecution is that Christy Slavic is like, Sean Combs has a small army of personal staff. No one could stop him. He uses inner circle and money to cover up his crimes, and even referred to his assistants as foot soldiers and other things like that. So really kind of pointing out how the assistants, how those who were in Sean Combs' inner circle really kind of helped build this case of racketeering conspiracy against the defendant.
Yeah, that he's the leader of this criminal organization, that the assistants, the security, they helped pull off the freak-offs. They knew it was wrong. They were the go-to people. They knew about the sex tapes. They got drugs for freak-offs. Christina, she knew what was going on. D-Rock got ice for Cassie's black eye. So I get it, right? This idea that everybody was on the same page. Now, for the prosecution to win this charge, they have to prove at least 2 underlying predicate crimes, right? And you tell me what stood out the most. Was it forced labor? Was it kidnapping? Was it arson? Which, by the way, there was a whole back and forth yesterday. Oh, is arson and kidnapping still part of the case? Yes, it is. They might have decided to not move forward with attempted arson or attempted kidnapping, but they're still moving forward with actual kidnapping and arson, or conspiracy to commit these crimes. So which of the underlying crimes really stood out to you today? I know the prosecution addressed all of them, but was it forced labor? Was it the drug offenses? Was it arson? Was it kidnapping? Was it bribery? Which were the ones that you think if the jury has to decide, oh, these are the two we're going to find him guilty of, or we think these are the predicate crimes for racketeering, this pattern of criminal activity, which were some of the ones that stood out to you?
Well, to your point, Jesse, the prosecution laying out again that the government only has to prove two of these acts, but as they're listing drug distribution, kidnapping, arson, bribery, sex trafficking, forced labor, witness tampering, interstate transportation for prostitution, you really could pick any of them because I feel like the government made very strong cases for all of them. But some of the ones that really kind of stood out to me, and I think for maybe a different way than maybe people think, was kind of drug distribution, because I think a lot of people, in terms of just the drugs and overall kind of components that go to it, that people think, Sean Combs had to be transporting, kilos and large quantities of drugs. But really, the government was kind of laying out that delivering or passing on drugs kind of count as distribution. And so I think Christy Slavic made a pretty strong argument where she said a special ingredients that, talking about the drugs, were required for freak-off. So each and every time she's kind of talking about the predicate act, she's talking about all the players involved. So in terms of drug distribution, she specifically talked about D-Rock, KK, and Fahim Muhammad. And so the two elements that kind of go with that is that the co-conspirators distributed the drugs, but also the second element being that the co-conspirator distributed the drugs knowingly. And so she listed all the drugs out because drugs was something that was very common throughout all the testimony that the witnesses had. So she talked about cocaine, meth, ketamine, oxycodone, Xanax, MDMA, GHB, 2C, and mushrooms as well. And so she said that the quantity is not relevant. It's not an element of this crime. And so she says, the jury has heard a number of names, including Guido, One Stop, Baby Girl, as some of the drug dealers that were used, but also just the money that kind of goes and is attached to just, the assistants reaching out to KK or Fahim Muhammad, talking about reimbursement for payments such as $450 of a balance for drugs or $780 to go towards the personal Gucci items. And as they talked about throughout a lot of witness testimony, the Gucci items normally refer to the drugs that were in a specific Gucci bag that Sean Combs always had on his person, or that the assistants were required to carry just near and around Sean Combs. But even in terms of just distributing the drugs to others, the prosecution named a number of people that it kind of falls under there, where it's including Cassie and Jane and Carrie Morgan and Bonna and Mia, and how Mia and Brendan Paul specifically were even made to kind of partake in this drug use. Mia testified that she kind of was given a different batch of all these different drugs, and it was kind of like a guessing game of which drug was which drug, and she had to take a line of it. Whereas Brendan Paul talked about the first time he did drugs outside of, marijuana was 2C with Sean Combs in order to kind of prove his loyalty. But I think another big thing, Jesse, was just the kidnapping aspect, because to your point, a lot of people are like, oh my God, there's no more kidnapping. Oh my God, there's no more arson. But the prosecution laid out 3 instances of kidnapping. One in January of 2009, when Cassie's face was stomped on and she was held at a hotel because Sean Combs got upset that she was talking to a producer, and Cassie drunkenly punched Sean Combs in the face, and then he physically assaulted her, and that Sean Combs forced her to stay in a hotel for a week, and that Bonds, the security guard, told her that she couldn't leave that hotel. And so the prosecution was like, Cassie didn't consent to staying at the London hotel during this particular alleged incident of kidnapping. Then there was another time where they brought it back to 2004 here in New York City with Capricorn Clark and the lie detector test after the jewelry went missing, and how the government said a person restricted victims' movements by confining her to a place. And so the prosecution laid out that the man who administered the test said if she refused, she would be thrown in the East River. That was something that Capricorn Clark had even testified to. And then obviously the biggest instance was December of 2011 with the whole Kid Cudi kind of aspect, where Capricorn Clark says that a gun was pointed at her face by Sean Combs. She was forced into this car and was driven over to Kid Cudi's home, all because Sean Combs was upset that he being Kid Cudi, was seeing Cassie Ventura fine. But that Capricorn had even testified again that Sean Combs held a gun at her. She didn't want to go with him, and that all the players involved with that particular instance of alleged kidnapping was Capricorn Clark, Rue, who was a security security guard, Sean Combs, how they drove over to Kid Cudi's home in Capricorn Park, didn't consent. Now, obviously, Jesse, there's a number of other interesting points where you talk about bribery and other things, too, that are very interesting. But those, to me, are the ones that definitely stood out the most.
Yeah, bribery. Eddie Garcia, the hotel security guard who was allegedly paid $100,000 that he split with others to hand over the videotape of Sean Combs reportedly beating Cassie. I thought that was a significant point. Forced labor, the idea of Mia, this personal assistant, being allegedly sexually assaulted by Sean Combs, but also the idea of the two main alleged victims in this case, Jane and Cassie. They were forced to perform sex acts, right? This forced labor concept. So let's talk about Jane and let's talk about Cassie. Let's take it piece by piece. They each make up, as I said, individual sex trafficking counts and individual counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. But when we talk about sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, let's talk about Jane. What did the prosecutor say today in closing arguments to say that Jane is a victim of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion? What did she say about that?
Well, I think, Jesse, the sex trafficking aspect as it specifically pertains to Jane is pretty interesting because the government says you only have to find one instance of sex trafficking. So sure, the government has a very long list of all these different flights and locations and hotel rooms, all to kind of point out that all of these instances of hotel nights were possibly alleged sex trafficking, but only the jury has to find one particular instance, and then the defendant, in the perfect way the government probably wants, is guilty of sex trafficking. But as it comes to Jane, and by the way, whenever they were talking about Jane, the gallery screen that we're able to see that kind of shows the public and the media and everyone who's sitting inside the courtroom, that was completely shut off. So only the jury is seeing these particular exhibits, the text messages, the photos, as it pertains to Jane, mainly because, of Jane, she testified under a pseudonym and they just want to protect her privacy just a little bit more. But in terms of just the different stages of sex trafficking, the government said that the first stage was Jane kind of learning about the drugs and the outfits and putting pornography on, because they were saying that Sean Combs kind of groomed Jane into sex trafficking. So they say that first stage, again, being the drugs, the outfits, putting pornography on, something that kind of Diddy enjoyed according to her testimony. But she said the second stage was the fantasy talk, and how the fantasy talk kind of pertained to Jane with other men, and that Sean Combs made it happen eventually. And then that third stage was using a payment of rent, because as we know, Sean Combs was paying for her rent $10,000 a month, which we learned during the trial that he's still paying for even at this time, but that payment of rent was used as leverage. And so Christy Slavic is like, he reminds her he can take things away from her anytime that he wants to. And so the government said that the hotel nights weren't about what Jane wanted, it was about what the defendant wanted. He made Jane sext with the entertainers because, as the defense kind of pointed out, using Jane's messages kind of in a way against her, we're saying, okay, hey, look, she's reaching out to these escorts or these entertainers all on her own. But the government is saying that Sean Combs made Jane kind of sex with these entertainers, and that Jane wanted the escorts to wear condoms. However, Sean Combs didn't want them to wear condoms, and that he would be dismissive and condescending whenever she kind of was vocal about wanting these escorts to wear protection. The government also saying throughout those months, the defendant continued to dangle different carrots in her face, such as gifts, such as trips, such as shopping. And then we heard an audio message from Sean Combs to Jane where he says, I'm not going to play these games with you. You'll just have silence. We can have spats, but you need to get on your job. And the government's kind of pointing out that get on your job was her doing these hotel nights. But in terms of Jane kind of voicing her opinion about not wanting to do the hotel nights, because if you go back to her testimony at the beginning, she thought initially that it was going to be a one-time thing, that at first it was exciting and taboo, and she just wanted to pretty much please her partner. But then towards the end, she was kind of voicing that she felt like these hotel nights were all that she was used for, and that she said she was saying these things about voicing her opinions, that she was saying it for months even prior to Cassie's lawsuit, where the jury was able to see some messages from Jane to Sean Combs where she says, I feel like I'm reading my own sexual trauma. On 2 of my birthdays, you forced me to perform with with entertainers. Then the jury was able to hear, these audio recordings, some that we've already heard before, where Jane is saying, I want you to know, and then Sean Combs kind of cuts her off and he says, are you recording me? What are you talking talking about kind of showing these different instances where it turns out she was being recorded, but that Sean Combs in a way was kind of playing it like, oh, maybe he's manipulating her because he's implying that she's recording him when truly she was the one that was being recorded on. And so then they kind of talked about after Cassie's lawsuit where Jane's relationship with Sean Combs changed. She stopped seeing him for months, but the government points out that Sean Combs told Jane to charge him. They kind of imply that it was to buy her silence because Jane had asked for about $100,000 per year that they were together for her loss of money and her time, plus what she had to endure for these hotel nights, and kind of pointing out that charging was significantly less than what Cassie ended up getting in her settlement with Sean Combs after she filed her lawsuit. But in terms of just threats that were made too, the government point out that Sean Combs threatened to release her sex tapes to her child's father, and that the government says that Jane reached out to Christina about the threats, and that she again didn't speak with him for about 2 months after he had threatened to release these sexually explicit videos and photos of her to her child's father, and that they ended up reconnecting around her birthday, which is in February of 2024, because Sean Combs says that they would spend wholesome time together. Lo and behold, that an escort was being contacted by Sean Combs so that way they could do another hotel night. So those were just some of the instances of sex trafficking by Jane. But in terms of just all these different instances of specific sex trafficking, they point to the sobriety party of October of 2023, where Jane wanted to do a hotel night without drugs, and then she ended up throwing up in between escort number 2 and escort number 3. They also point to the June 18th, 2024 incident that happened at Jane's house where she was physically assaulted. And then at the end of it, when she said she was forced to do a hotel night even after being assaulted, Sean Combs said something to her saying, "Is this coercion?" And I think the government was really kind of pointing out that coercion was the specific word that Sean Combs used. And so those were just some of the instances of alleged sex trafficking as it pertains to Jane.
Yeah. And that goes to knowledge. That goes to the knowledge component, because the defense is going to say, how was he supposed to know they didn't really want this? Well, if the jury believes that he said that to her, that's significant. And I have to tell you, I think the highlight from this day was the prosecution saying that consenting once or consenting several times doesn't mean that either a Jane or a Cassie consented every time. One instance of sex trafficking, you laid them out so perfectly, the jury has to believe just one of them. If it fits the elements of sex trafficking, he could be convicted of that. Now, we go on to Cassie, okay? Cassie Ventura Fine. Why, according to Prosecutor Slavic, is she a victim of sex trafficking?
Yeah, well, right off the top, when it came to count 2, and that again pertaining to Cassie, the prosecution said, before there was Jane, because they talked about all the points related to Jane, they talked about Cassie afterwards. So she had said before there was Jane, there was Cassie. And so they were really kind of laying out the roadmap of how this sex trafficking pretty much came to be, where it started with early points of their relationship, then it went into the abuse, then it went into the freak-offs, then it went into the end of their relationship. So at the beginning stages of their relationship, Cassie is around 19 years old. She's signed to Bad Boy. And so the government's kind of pointing out not only is she dating a significantly older man, but also that this man also happens to be her boss. And so the government was also talking about just the abuse she endured. And I think that's something that they may have on their side, where they have photos, they have video evidence, i.e. the surveillance video from the Intercontinental Hotel, that kind of possibly may work in the government's favor, especially as it pertains to Cassie. And so the government said the defense doesn't deny the abuse, that the defendant just wants to pretty much call it domestic violence. And that's something that a lot of people, even on social media, are saying. They're like, this isn't sex trafficking. This is a domestic violence case. He should have been charged with domestic violence. But according to the government and the way they were laying it out, they're kind of saying, there's a lot of different examples when it comes to sex trafficking and Cassie. And they really kind of talked about the amount of violence examples, really pointing out that the ones they listed in their closing argument were just one of many. So they point to the 2007 incident that happened after a dinner, 2010 after a Princess party, or at Princess Party, where Princess security even had to intervene. They talked about 2011, where Sean Combs attacked Cassie after he found out she was sleeping with Kid Cudi. 2013, when Sean Combs attacked Cassie in her apartment when Cassie was with Mia and Deontay. 2013, again that same year, where Sean Combs assaulted Cassie in Jamaica because she was taking too long in the bathroom. 2015, where Sean Combs beat up Cassie at a Las Vegas party, and D-Rock actually ended up crying after seeing Cassie's injuries. And then, of course, the 2016 2016 incident that happened at the Intercontinental Hotel. But the government also pointing out that Sean Combs attacked Cassie's friends too, like Deontay Nash and Bonna and Mia and even Carrie Morgan, all of which had testified to when they were called to testify in this specific trial. But in terms of just kind of using even Dr. Dawn Hughes' testimony to kind of help paint the picture a little bit more in these summations, the question always is, why didn't she leave? And so the government points to Dr. Hughes' testimony about Sean Combs' inner circle kind of helping preventing Cassie from leaving at times. They point to Christina Coram and Rubin and Roger Bonds and even D-Rock, where Christina Coram did all the defendant's bidding. D-Rock was only loyal to the defendant. D-Rock, at one point, text messages were shown of D-Rock telling Sean Combs, Cass is calling the studio. She's looking for you. Sean Combs says, time for the ice. What's Cass up to? Does her eye look better? How is she holding up? And then D-Rock responds, well, Rio and Justin saw her. We said that a fight broke out in the club. And again, these are messages that the jury's already seen, but really kind of putting into context as it pertains to count 2. And then, of course, the freak-offs. And so the government really was talking about how over the course of their relationship, there were hundreds of freak-offs. I mean, the two were together for 11 years on and off, but the government showed text messages where Cassie said, I love our FOs when we both want them. And so I think kind of pointing to, you know, Cassie initially consented to doing this, but towards the end to her testimony and even pointing back to her lawsuit, you know, just because she agreed to do it once doesn't mean she agreed to do it every single time, every single instance. And she even said that she had to do these freak-offs while she was on her menstrual cycle and she had a UTI and how escorts urinated in her mouth. And the government says that you being the jury, don't have to prove every freak-off was sex trafficking, just one. And so they said it's not an all or nothing thing. It's really just that one instant that could possibly make him guilty of sex trafficking.
And I will tell you, I thought it was brilliant for the prosecution to sprinkle in the testimony of Dr. Dawn Hughes to explain what sometimes would look like inconsistent behavior of a victim, to explain why this happens. And so to keep bringing her up at certain critical times as they talk about Cassie, very, very important. Now I want to move on to the final charges. So we got transportation to engage in prostitution, which I have said feels like the most straightforward charge. Prosecutors have to prove that he literally transported, not even sex workers, they don't even have to be prostitutes, just men across state lines for the purposes of sex work. That's it, right? Transporting them and the alleged victims for the purposes of sex work. I think they even highlighted today, you don't need force, fraud, or coercion. You don't even need really consent. So what did she say about transportation to engage in prostitution?
Well, I think a lot of people have to remember that that goes to count 3 and count 5. Count 3, again, going to Cassie, and then count 5 going to Jane. So he's charged 2 different ways with this. And then it also kind of falls under count 1 with RICO conspiracy too. But in terms of count 3 related to Cassie, the government says that the defendant told Cassie to book travel for these escorts, and that these escorts would travel to places like Ibiza, as an example, or New York City. And so they kind of brought back that flight summary chart, again, something that I think kind of works in their favor, because the jury can take this back when they go to deliberations and really see everything kind of laid out in a way like a roadmap. And so they point to one specific instance starting in August of 2009, August 26th of that year, where Sean Combs coordinated with Jules being the escort that Cassie and Sean Combs used often during their freak-offs, but I think also notably, he was the escort that was inside that hotel room during the March 2016 incident at the Intercontinental Hotel. But in terms of just transportation to engage in prostitution, they brought up flight records, including a $419 flight to get Jules over to New York City from Los Angeles, also a $220 limo service that was also paid for by Sean Combs, and that Sean Combs even texted Jules that he'll tip him more if he can make it out to New York City, because again, he's traveling from LA. So there's that transportation right there. And then the government points to the defendant paid for Clayton Howard, aka Dave, another escort that was used to fly him to Los Angeles from New York City. And so the government, again, relying on that flight records, that summary chart that was shown kind of towards the end of the trial, just saying that the defendant is guilty on count 3 in every single one of these instances. And it's a lot of instances on that specific chart. And so as it pertains to count 5 in relation to Jane, the government says that the defendant transported escorts, or entertainers, as Jane calls them, like Cabral to Miami, to Los Angeles, to New York, because Cabral is specifically from Atlanta. Atlanta. I think he's even named as ATL in Sean Combs's phone. And so the government said that Jane, although she set up the travel and paid for the flights for Cabral to get over to New York or Miami or Los Angeles, that she was always reimbursed by Sean Combs. They also talk about how Jessica Ruiz also, and she's the travel agent, also set up travel because of course that's her job, but that obviously who are the payments coming from? The account holder being assigned to Sean Combs. And so the government even talked about the defendant transporting an entertainer, or Paul, somebody that Jane and Sean Combs used during their hotel nights, to Turks and Caicos. And he was traveling from Los Angeles for these hotel nights or Wild King nights, whatever you want to call them. And so the government said the defendant directed Jane to have hotel nights with 3 escorts, that Reggie, an escort or entertainer, whatever we want to call them, that he flew out from Vegas to Los Angeles. And so the government showed text messages from Sean Combs to Bridget, who runs Cowboys for Angels. No longer Garrett, it's now Bridget who's the contact for that, according to these messages, where Sean Combs says, LOL, damn, we don't want to have a tired situation, feel me. And Bridget says, Reggie is never tired. So again, transporting Reggie over from Vegas to Los Angeles, I think it's probably one of the strongest charges that the government has, in their holster here. But of course, the way the government was laying out these closing arguments, they really kind of, if I was somebody who didn't know this case at all and I was coming in for the first time listening to these closing arguments, I feel like the government has a really strong case on all counts, not just counts 3 and 5, but on all counts. But we'll see what happens when the defense starts their closing arguments, which should be possibly fireworks. We'll wait and see. But really quickly, Jesse, I kind of want to talk about just the demeanor of these closing arguments, that they were very methodical. They were very a little monotone at times. But at the same time, I was kind of thinking there would be a moment of just animation, because it's a high-profile defendant, a high-profile trial, that there would just be moments of just like animation or projection and voice, some of that. But that didn't really happen. It really was, at times, it felt like Christy Slavic was really just kind of reading out all of her closing arguments, which I get. I can only imagine how that is to have to speak to a jury for hours on end. But in terms of just what I thought maybe that I would have loved to have seen her do is just be a little more personable in these closing arguments. She really kind of only addressed the jury specifically towards the end of it, where she thanked them for their time. But I think she should have probably did that at the beginning. And then there were points where they were a little repetitive, but I think overall she did a great job really kind of laying out. There were a bunch of puzzle pieces that the jury has. And now I think Christy Slavic really helped kind of put everything together. But again, we'll have to wait to see what the defense comes up with tomorrow when they do their closings.
Yeah, it seems to me, look, their main goal was condensing a very complicated case with a lot of information into an easily digestible format. And based on what you're telling me and what I've read, it seems that she did it. Now, a very sober, very serious presentation. We'll see how the jury responds to it. Real quick, before I let you go, because I know the defense is coming on tomorrow, I believe 9 a.m. with Mark Agnifilo, scheduled for 4 hours, and maybe we'll even see a rebuttal case from the prosecution, a rebuttal closing. Real quick, any reaction from Diddy or the jurors today?
I think in terms of Diddy, I think, there were times where I just kind of saw him just looking kind of towards the judge's direction, not really looking in the direction of Christy Slavic giving the closings, or even the jury kind of in the jury box. But also he might have just been looking at all the presentation on kind of the lawyer's computer screens. And so there were times where I kind of saw him with his head down. He might have been jotting some notes down to his attorney, that type of thing. But there were kind of points where he did get a little upset when he was accused of raping Cassie in 2018. Right before they had broken up kind of for good. There was a point where Christy Slavic was like, the defendant is texting Cassie, I'm sorry I raped you. And Sean Combs did kind of make like a disgusted look. So I think the defense is going to really kind of point that out tomorrow in their closing to really kind of bounce back from that. But even for the most part of the closings, I kind of saw him doing what he normally does, jotting those notes down, listening, kind of looking towards the jury to get their reaction. But I think most notably, his biggest reaction was seeing his family inside the courtroom. I think it meant a lot to him that his family was there to support him and be there for a pretty pivotal day, especially as we're getting towards the end of the trial now.
We really are. Elizabeth Millner, excellent reporting as always. Really appreciate it. And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.